There's a moment most people never talk about. It usually comes late at night, or in the middle of a decision you can't stop circling. It's that quiet, uncomfortable feeling that somewhere inside you, someone already knows the answer. Not the version of you that's stressed or tired or afraid of what other people think. A deeper version. A steadier one. One that's been watching everything and waiting. That version of you is what we're going to talk about today. And what I'm about to share isn't motivational content. It's not about mindset or positive thinking. It's about something far more specific and far more strange that researchers, therapists, and ancient cultures have known for a very long time. It's about why you feel lost and how a single shift in the way you speak to yourself can change that permanently. Let's start with something that might actually disturb you. Scientists put people inside fMRI machines, brain scanners, and ask them simple questions about themselves. Are you funny? Are you kind? Are you patient? And as you'd expect, a certain part of the brain lit up, the part associated with self-awareness, with identity. Then they asked the same people to think about a celebrity, someone like Matt Damon or Natalie Portman, and a completely different part of the brain activated. Here's where it gets unsettling. When they asked people to think about themselves, but 10 years in the future, the brain didn't treat that future person as the same self. It lit up in exactly the same region as when people thought about a celebrity, a stranger, someone they had never met. Your own brain, right now, has already filed your future self under other person. And not just any other person. A person you feel less urgency to care for, less responsibility toward, someone you can postpone things on behalf of without guilt. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable neurological fact discovered by UCLA psychologist Hal Hershfield, and it explains something enormous. It explains why we make promises to our future selves and break them without much shame. It explains why we neglect our health, avoid the hard conversations, stay too long in the wrong situations. We are, at a biological level, slightly cruel to the person we are becoming, because our brain genuinely doesn't experience that person as us. But there's a flip side to this that almost no one talks about. If your future self is already registered in your brain as another person, then you can have a conversation with them. A real one. Not as a fantasy, not as visualization, but as a genuine act of consultation, the way you would ask someone wiser than you for advice. And when you do that in the right way, the research shows it doesn't just feel good, it physically changes your behavior. In one set of studies, researchers had people put on virtual reality headsets and stand in front of a mirror. Staring back at them was an aged version of their own face. They spent about 5 minutes with that image, that's all. And across 4 separate experiments, every single group that interacted with their aged self showed the same result. They made more patient decisions, delayed gratification more easily, and were significantly more willing to sacrifice something now for something better later. The effect wasn't subtle. People allocated nearly twice as much money to long-term savings after just one brief encounter with their older self. Twice as much, from 5 minutes. And they hadn't been given any advice. They hadn't been told what to do. They had simply met someone they recognized. Now here is something even more striking that almost never gets mentioned in conversations about self-help or personal growth. Connecting with your wise old self doesn't just change your financial decisions. It changes your ethics. One study found that the more connected people felt to their future self, the more honestly they behaved today. Another study took that even further. Teenagers who befriended a digital version of their future self by exchanging messages with it for just 7 days on a social network reported significantly less involvement in delinquent behavior. Not because anyone lectured them, not because consequences were made clearer, but because when your future self becomes vivid and real, you stop being willing to betray them. Think about that. You're not lost because you're weak or confused or broken. You might be lost because the wisest version of you feels like a stranger, and strangers are easy to ignore. So how do you stop treating your future self as a stranger? The first thing to understand is that the way you speak to yourself in your own head is not neutral. It is the most powerful communication channel you have, and most people are unconsciously running it on autopilot. Research shows that we spend a significant portion of our waking lives in internal dialogue. But here's the piece that's almost never discussed in popular culture. The pronouns you use inside that dialogue change what your brain actually does with the information. Psychologist Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan ran a series of experiments on this. He found that people who used second-person pronouns, you, or addressed themselves by their own name when facing stressful situations, performed measurably better under pressure and experienced less anxiety than people who used I statements. Saying "I'm so nervous" keeps you trapped inside the emotion. Saying "you've done hard things before" or using your own name creates just enough distance for the wiser part of you to be heard. Psychologists call this psychological distancing. What they're describing without using the language is what it feels like to consult your wise old self, instead of spinning inside your fearful young one. And this is where the therapeutic world has something fascinating to offer, something it's been doing quietly for over 70 years. Gestalt therapists in the 1950s developed what they called the empty chair technique. You sit across from an empty chair, and you speak to whoever or whatever you imagine sitting in it. A parent, a version of yourself, a feeling, and then crucially, you switch chairs. You sit in the other seat and respond as if you were that person. What makes this more than a theatrical exercise is what happens neurologically. When you force yourself to physically occupy a different perspective, your brain has to generate new responses. It cannot simply replay the familiar script. The body moving into a new chair interrupts the loop. But here is something even more interesting that researchers discovered only recently. The technique works dramatically better when you add a third chair, not the anxious part, not the critical part, not the part that wants to give up, but the calm, witnessing, compassionate presence that has no agenda except clarity. In internal family systems therapy, the clinical term for this is simply self. And the research is clear. When inner parts of your personality speak to each other without this self present, they stay stuck. They keep arguing. They don't change. It is only when the self is present, when the wise center of you is listening with compassion, that parts feel safe enough to release what they've been holding. What this means practically is that the wise old self you're trying to access isn't somewhere you're going. It's not a future version of you that hasn't been built yet. It's a quality of awareness that already exists inside you, right now, that most people spend their entire lives not knowing how to access. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, which is used in hospitals and clinical settings worldwide, teaches this as a skill called wise mind. It is the integration of your logical mind and your emotional mind, not one dominating the other, but both held together by something steadier beneath them. They teach it to patients in psychiatric units. They teach it to people in crisis, because it works, and it can be practiced the same way you practice anything else, through deliberate, repeated engagement until it becomes automatic. Now, let's talk about writing, because this is where things get genuinely unusual. Most people who try to connect with a wiser version of themselves do it in their heads. They think about it. They intend to reflect. But research shows that writing creates an entirely different neurological event. When you write, physically with your hand, or even typed intentionally, your prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and executive function, begins working in concert with your hippocampus, which processes memory. Together they produce what researchers call autobiographical reasoning, your brain's ability to construct a coherent story linking who you were, who you are, and who you're becoming. You are not just thinking, you are literally building the neural architecture of a continuous self. James Pennebaker's research at the University of Texas showed that expressive writing activates the brain's language centers, while simultaneously calming the amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for fear, threat response, and panic. This means that when you sit down and write a letter from your wise old self, you are not only receiving wisdom, you are chemically settling down enough to hear it. The act of writing is itself the intervention. And here's one more layer that almost no one mentions. Information you generate yourself is remembered significantly better than information you consume. Psychologists call this the generation effect. The advice your wise self gives you in writing, advice that you are technically producing yourself, will stick in your memory more deeply than anything you read in a book or hear in a podcast. You're not getting information from outside. You are surfacing something that was already inside, and that origin point is what makes it last. There's also a cultural dimension to all of this that modern self-help almost completely ignores. For most of human history, the wise old self didn't live inside you alone. It lived in the village elder. It was embodied, available, consulted regularly. In Inuit tradition, elders are considered essential not just to culture, but to mental health. They facilitate healing circles, guide people through life transitions, hold the community's emotional architecture together. In many indigenous traditions globally, the knowledge held by elders was not just respected. It was the infrastructure through which decisions were made. Naming a child, navigating conflict, responding to crisis. None of it was done without consulting those who had lived long enough to see further. What happened in the modern West is that we moved seniors into care facilities, stopped building multi-generational households, and gradually stripped age of its authority. We kept the nostalgia and removed the function. And in doing so, we lost access to one of our oldest tools for finding direction. The practice of consulting your inner wise self is, in part, a way of filling that gap, not as a spiritual bypass, not as fantasy, but as a recognition that within you, the accumulation of everything you've lived through already contains more wisdom than you typically allow yourself to access. This is why the Anishinaabe oral tradition of the Seven Fires prophecy is so striking when you look at it through this lens. 7 prophets, speaking across different eras, sending messages forward through time to guide future generations through choices they would face. It is essentially a civilization constructing a collective wise self, encoding hard-won understanding into a form that could be consulted long after the originators were gone. Every culture that survived long enough built some version of this. The mechanism changes. The underlying architecture is the same. Now let's bring this back to you, sitting where you are right now. If you feel lost, genuinely persistently lost, there's a high probability that it's not because you lack information. It's not because you haven't read enough, haven't worked hard enough, haven't tried enough approaches. The research points to something more precise. You feel lost because the wisest version of you feels like a stranger. And we are, by neurological default, relatively indifferent to the needs and opinions of strangers. The solution is not to acquire more. The solution is to close the distance. You can do this through visualization, but be careful. Pure positive visualization of a perfect future self actually backfires, according to research by psychologist Gabrielle Oettingen. The brain registers the imagined success as real success, and motivation drops. What works is consultation, not fantasy. Not imagining your wise old self living a perfect life, but sitting with them, asking them something specific, listening. You can do this by writing, not a journal entry about how you feel today, but a letter from your 80-year-old self to your current self. Use second person, use your own name, let that older version of you be direct, unhurried, and honest. They've already been where you are. They know which fears were worth it, and which ones were thieves. They know what they wish they had started earlier. They know what they wish they had let go of sooner. You can do this by paying attention to that nagging feeling you keep mislabeling as anxiety. Because here's something that the research on internal dialogue actually suggests. That persistent, low-grade sense that you're off track, that something isn't right, that you're living slightly smaller than you're capable of, that might not be anxiety at all. That might be your wise self using the only channel you've left open. And all it needs, to speak more clearly, is a little less noise and a little more deliberate attention. The ancient cultures knew this. The neuroscientists have now confirmed it. The therapists have been practicing it for decades. Your wisest self is not somewhere in the future, waiting for you to earn the right to arrive. It is here, now, in the part of you that already knows what matters, and is tired of being overruled. Stop treating it like a stranger. It's you. It's always been you. And the moment you start speaking to it, and listening, is the moment you stop feeling lost.